All right, we should be live. Hello, everybody. We're gonna go ahead and give everybody a few minutes to continue trickling in here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who are in, can we go ahead and get a confirmation in chat that you can hear me, see me, I sound okay? Perfect, perfect. Are you able to see a screen share? Tim, I see you. Okay. Perfect. Perfect. Cool. Go ahead and give it a few minutes. Appreciate all you guys taking the time out to come get some free Microsoft education. It's going to be a good one. I'm watching you, Tim. Feel free to share this with anybody in your network who might want to jump in. Go ahead and give it 2 more minutes. Hey, Jillian, I just sent you an email address. Can you send the meeting invite to that, please? Infamous Chris Carr. Appreciate you coming, man. Means a lot. Okay, give it about 1 more minute, and then we'll go ahead and dive in. Has to not keep you guys waiting. This will be recorded, and there will be some slides available, I believe, at the end here. And I'll let Mark kind of get into that whenever we start. All right. Now that we've gotten a good chunk of you guys in here, I think we'll have some more trickle in over the next few minutes. But I wanted to go ahead and welcome everybody in here to the Microsoft 365 Attack of the Default Config webinar. My name is Rowdy Hayday, and I am from the Prescriptive Data team. Today, we're going to be going over what we call the Attack of the Default Config, kind of what that means. And of course, we're going to be providing you guys with some tips and tricks that you can take away and hopefully apply to your own environment if you need to. A few ground rules before we get started here. Everybody in attendance is here for the webinar, so we'll have everybody muted. Cameras will be off. And then about halfway through, we'll have a little Q&A break, restroom break, drink break, where I highly encourage you guys to utilize the chat box throughout the webinar. Jillian and myself will be watching and relaying questions to Mark during those breaks, as we will leave the microphones off just to keep everything organized. That being said, I'd like to introduce Mark Alexander from the Prescriptive team, our director of the Microsoft practice, and he'll go ahead and take the reins here. Mark.
Thank you, Rowdy. Appreciate everybody joining us. Hopefully you had a little bit of time to grab something to eat, but you know, being in IT as long as I have been, you're probably maybe trying to get something to eat right now. But anyways, without further ado, yes, thank you again for attending, and want to dive straight in. Going to be coming at you fast. It's going to be a very rigorous presentation diving into technical details. And like Rowdy had mentioned, we are going to have a break kind of in the middle, and then we'll transition into the second phase of the presentation. And as mentioned, we will be providing you with a copy of this presentation. So I've got some links that are included throughout. So don't get hung up so much on where those are located. You'll have that at the end of the meeting for all attendees. So yeah, without further ado, let's dive right in. So what will we be talking about? So we're going to be talking about attack of the default config. And I love that title because, I mean, whether you're new to this game, you've just recently created a tenant, or you've been around for a while and you've inherited a tenant, or even, you know, you've stepped into a new role at a new organization and you have really no idea what's going on with an existing tenant. But these are all of those things they keep me up at night, right? But it's specifically the key user and guest settings. We'll even talk about some enterprise application consent reports that you can locate. And we're going to transition over into some device settings, including some tips and tricks that I like to throw out there, and maybe some things you may not even been aware of in regards to 365 inventory management. And then in the middle, we'll have that break. And then part two, we'll start diving into security defaults and conditional access policies and hopefully clarify some questions that you may have in that space. We'll cover security defaults. And then I'm going to show you something you may not be aware of that Microsoft just recently did. So before we begin, I'd like to explain the screenshots that you're going to see in this presentation were taken by a default tenant that I recently created. Now, I did the best that I could to not change anything. You'll see a couple places where I did, and I'll call this to attention. But this is the premise. This is what a default tenant looks like, and I believe Microsoft's intention was to ensure that ease of use was the forefront or the primary focus of it. But I think there's a significant set of gaps that you'll see quickly in regards to security. So let's get into attack of the default config. So if you want to follow along in this section, you'll see at the top I've got the Azure portal, and we're going to be in Intra ID and then in the user settings. And you'll see that in the screenshot here on the left under that manage title, you'll see the user settings. So right here, we have 5 settings that you want to look at and review. Number 1 is the ability for users to register applications. That shows enterprise apps that we'll get into the review later. And then there's this option to restrict non-admin users from creating tenants. Well, this is one of those funny ones. As you can see here in the screenshot, no users that are non-admin are not restricted. So no, they're not restricted. You would want to probably change this to a blue. Yes, you want to restrict them. And then number 3 is users can create security groups. I would prefer to have my IT team create those security groups and, you know, prevent my users from creating nilly-willy what they want to do. I like to keep a pretty clean tenant. And then number 4 pertains to guest user access settings, where, right, guests that are coming outside, you want to kind of treat them, you know, keep them in the lobby and keep them from looking beyond themselves, right? Not looking at any of the user objects or group objects within your directory. And then number 5, the most surprising and concerning of all on this screen is this is where that setting is. Yes, I would like my users to not see my admin center. So let's not even let them knock on the door. And I would change this to a yes to restrict. So 5 settings right out the gate. I told you we're going to come in fast. Now, there's actually another set of settings down below which pertain to guest user access. So I'll jump to this next screen. You have this small snippet of where we were just looking at. But down below, you'll see number 6, external users. And this is that setting where you can manage the external collaboration settings for your organization. So if you click on that, you'll get into number 7 and number 8. Number 7 is basically a repeat of that previous one where you only want your guest users to see their own properties and not be able to browse through your tenant. And then what I like is number 8 below is allow your IT team to invite guest users. Depending on your situation and your industry that you're in, some may absolutely be able to do this. Some may have to leave that a little more open, but I just wanted to draw to your attention, these are where those guest settings are. Okay. So now we've talked about user configs, some concerning settings, and then peered over to the guest user accounts, but I'd hinted about the enterprise applications and understanding the consent that is provided. So you could actually get reports in two manners. Number one, I like to define these as tier 1 tenants, and those are the business standard or E3, Microsoft E3 or lower tenants. There's actually some scripts, and again, for those that may be joining a little late here, we will be providing a copy of this presentation, so these links that I provide will be hot. You'll be able to find the details there, but there are scripts that are out there available, and you can see this is an actual Microsoft sourced article that spells out a GitHub location that will give you basically an Excel file export. And then for tier 2 tenants, you know how this works. You get what you pay for. So with the business premium and the E5 subscriptions, you actually get access to a portal that provides these details for you. Okay. So now enterprise apps, who's consented, users and guests. Let's pivot over to device settings, right? So it's in the similar place, right, in the Azure portal, but instead of users, we're going to go to devices, and we're going in that same manner under manage device settings. Take a little drink here. And so here we have 3 settings that are of interest, of concern. Number 1, by default, users are allowed to join devices to your Azure AD infrastructure. That's pretty concerning. Number 2, users are allowed to register their devices with Intra. Now, some of you may be familiar with these terms, but I want to, in the next slide, I will actually get into the differences between a join and a register. It may seem like a subtle difference in word choice, but it is a significant change in how those systems are managed. So you'll notice that number 2 is grayed out. Well, this is one of those settings that I had changed because in the default tenant, we had actually turned on Intune and MDM management. And when you do that, it grays out this setting. And then number 3, down at the bottom, I've got a flashing arrow here that suggests, right, Microsoft's recommendation is to use conditional access policies in order to drive whenever a user joins or registers a device to your tenant to force them to be prompted by MFA. So for those of you who are using security defaults, this would be the place where you would go to ensure that anybody joining or registering devices to your tenant will be MFA prompted. I'll cover that a little later when we talk about security defaults and that transition and our recommendation for your conditional access policies. So joins versus registers, what is that difference? Well, a registration, I want you to think about, those are BYOD devices. Those are the personal devices, right? So when you hear register, think mobile application management. So as a tenant, as an organization, whenever a device is registered with your tenant, all you can do is control the application access policies. You can't really configure or mandate or change the actual compliance or security settings of that device. Whereas a join, those are corporate owned devices. Those are tied into Azure AD and they're company owned, and that transitions into the bigger MDM or mobile device management policies where you can actually control and manage how the device is configured. So again, subtle, slight word difference, but it's a big deal. Register means BYOD, means mobile application management, and join means corporate owned and mobile device management. So like the enterprise app registrations, right? Here's some key principles that I'd like to convey when it comes to joining or registering devices to your tenant, right? At the end of the day, you want to gain control, right? You want to secure those corporate owned devices, those devices that are joined. So what that means is you want to make sure that you control who has the ability to join systems to your domain, right? Our recommendation is to ensure that your IT group can do that and take that ability away from your users. Well, why? Well, imagine a user account that is compromised. that user account can then join a computer to your tenant. And taking a step back, right? If you've recently, right, newly created a tenant, you have security defaults applied, but you don't necessarily have that user being prompted for MFA when they join. So yeah, this creates a potential security gap where a compromised account will allow a bad actor to actually join their device to your domain, to your Azure AD tenant, excuse me, your tenant. So that's a pretty big deal because it allows them to entrench further in your environment, right? So we want to shut off those doors. We want to shut off any potential vectors that they could come in. And yeah, again, required MFA joins. But yeah, we're going to be sure to cover that in our conditional access policy section in the next phase here. So additional key principles, right? So you want to shut that front door and you want to put some mechanisms in place to ensure that you're doing inventory management of your devices. So for some of you that are in larger environments, I know this is a daunting task. It's a big deal because you have so many assets that are in your environment, and then you have to get into understanding the age of them and whatnot. One way you can do this is Intra ID actually provides a list of device inventory. You can actually download that to Excel. And then I've also provided a PowerShell resource here that allows you to use some PowerShell scripts to connect. And the reason why I wanted to make sure I provided this to you is, again, remember the difference between joined and registered devices. It gets a little confusing. And under the device trust type, whenever you're pulling these details, you'll see, even though it says workplace join, that actually means that it's a registered or personal device. Those other two tags down at the bottom show that they're actually corporate owned and joined devices. So inventory management. So along those lines, I don't know. I found a very welcome nugget when I first started managing my own Microsoft tenants. There's actually a built-in asset inventory tool within the Office 365 apps. What I'm talking about is the click to run apps. So for your, what would it be? It would be your business standard, your business premium, your E3 and E5 subscriptions, right? You're entitled to download the Office suite. So the Word, PowerPoint, Outlook, and so on and so forth. Believe it or not, it actually contains an asset management component. And if you actually go here in config.office.com, I included this little screenshot here. If you're following along, the first time you go in there, it's actually going to start building up resources to start gathering these inventory details. This is normal. This is expected. This doesn't mean that you're going to be paying something extra. No, it's just this first time that you're in there, it's actually going to spin up those resources. And here's a very, very useful article on all of the details that it provides. But the key here is your only requirement is to install that Office 365 click to run. It's a huge deal. The biggest benefit in this scenario is, if you think about it, right, a user has to be assigned a 365 standard or premium or E3, E5 license. So what this does, you have to pay for this for commercial software, in that it ties the user to the actual device, which is a pretty big deal when it comes to inventory management. You get to see, again, just by installing the Office Click to Run apps, you get to see who's using what machines, and you get that people to machine linkage. It's very, very valuable. So we've been diving very deep, very quick, running through a bunch of scenarios. I want to take a 5-minute break right now to answer any questions you have over what we've covered thus far. So I'll take a little pause here and talk about, right? So to remind everyone, we walked through user and guest policies. We looked at the enterprise registration consent reports. We got into some of those device settings and configuration, within a tenant, and then talked about some device inventory management tools. Hopefully, maybe one of those you didn't know about, and gave some recommendations on how you can best approach locking down your inventory. So with that, I'm gonna pause for a minute and pivot over to the chat and see if we've got any questions. You can throw down in chat or Q&A. So, yeah, as Rowdy says, drop your questions in there. Great. Yeah. So Tim's talking about a nice little surprise with the Office 365 inventory tools. Yeah, that was a pleasant surprise that I discovered. And leave it up to Microsoft to kind of be sneaky about that. But I think the key, right, it's more than just an inventory of what machines you have in your environment. You get to see who is using which machines.
Hey, Mark, I got private messaged a question here.
Okay.
Should we have the same security concerns about device registrations as you focused on about the joins? Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's a good question. So I would put them in two different tiers, right? So a joined device, think of that as your traditional, it's joined to Active Directory, right? It has access to the resources in the domain, right? And a joined device, right? You have more control over those settings. You can lock that device down a lot more is the basis, right? Whereas a registered device, you can require, when you get into more advanced conditional access policies, you can require that, that it be compliant, and not jailbroken. I think that actually that's on the MDM piece, right? Because that requires some of those Intune components. So you can investigate more about the health or condition of an asset. And then when you talk about a registered device, all they can do is they can basically get into your applications, right? And you can use conditional access policies to also shape that behavior. So in my mind, a registration or a BYOD device is I guess less of a security concern because all they're going to be provided is more on the application front and be in that MAM bucket, whereas an actual join device, you do have the ability to actually lock it down a lot more. So almost inversely, you can tighten up those assets better.
Cool. Appreciate that. We do have a couple questions in the chat now. First one coming from Zachary Marshall. How would you defend against compromised user accounts?
That's a trick question. Compromised user accounts. Well, it follows the general premise of cybersecurity controls, right? Number one, it's about figuring out what account was compromised, right? So one, you have to identify. You find that user account, and then you start to look at evidence of where that account came from. The good news, we'll just dive in a little bit here, is you can look at the sign-ins for that account, and you can start to pick up on some anomalies. Maybe they're logging in from different countries or abnormal locations. You can start to pinpoint IP addresses, and then you can turn that and look sideways on, are there any other accounts that may be coming from those same sources? I think I've skipped the most important part is once you know that some account has been compromised, my number one recommendation is absolutely block sign-ins, change passwords, and get custody of that account. So identify, contain, and then assess, right? So you contain, and you basically take ownership of that account by blocking any subsequent logins, and you only know the password. Therefore, you can dig in and look at what other activities that account may be doing. And then the assessment part is when you start looking at similar IP addresses or source locations where that account may be logging in. And then beyond that, it's about remediation, right? Do you think you have all the holes closed or where they came in from? Talking to the user, maybe they were a victim of a phishing campaign, and hopefully they admit that they clicked on a link that looked weird, and then you can kind of start to unravel those things, but that can turn into a big deep rabbit hole. So I think those will just be the high level aspects of that.
Yep, no worries. And then I know we do have about a minute left before your 5 minutes is up, just to keep that in mind. But we do have one more question from John Block. Is there a particular account that needs to be allowed to join devices to enter ID for devices that are being provisioned using autopilot?
Oh. Yeah, and I'm looking off screen. I'm over here looking at the chat. So if you see me looking, so I think that the idea would be right, in an autopilot scenario, you're going to be talking about more of a service account, right? You don't want to have that tied to an individual person. You want it to be tied to a specific account that's allowed to do those types of activities, right, within autopilot, up to and including where that account can be used from. So I think it's a great segue into our next topic, where I'll talk through my recommendations on an approach to your conditional access policies, and how you can actually, you know, allow service accounts to log in from known locations. Okay. So with that, I will pivot over and start the next section of the slide. So, okay, now we're going to dive in a little deeper. I don't know about you all, but anytime that I've tried to go out, in previous lives and previous orgs that I was at, digging into what are security defaults? How do I configure conditional access policies? I don't know, maybe after the fourth or fifth, Microsoft article, I lose track of where I'm at. I mean, there is good information out there, but I think this may be for some, if most of you, the first time, a prescriptive manner, intentional plug there, an approach on how to implement conditional access policies. So let's start with security defaults. Well, security defaults came around in late October of 2019. So think of that as the great divide. For tenants that were created before that, you didn't have security defaults enabled. Any newer tenants, absolutely, it's enabled by default. So what's the intention, right? It's designed to provide a base level standard set of security measures to protect tenants, right? These are all things you probably are known and dear to, right? They're enabled by default for those new tenants that are created after October 2019. And here's an actual link in your portal, right? Anytime that I want to go see this, I have to do some digging, but you can find it up there. And so previously I was using the Azure AD portal links. So in good spirit of Microsoft's affinity for changing names of everything, I've included the intro link this time. And you can find that under the identity section and under overview. And then on the properties tab, these things, I always overlook them. I like to call this hidden in plain sight. So even though it is a tab, sometimes you just, as you're clicking around, you just miss them. But right in there is where you can go to manage security defaults down at the bottom on this properties tab, and then enable or disable. Okay. So what do the security defaults provide? Well, number one, the biggest component is it drives your tenant towards MFA. So what it does is it requires all users to register for MFA, and it requires MFA authentication for user administrators. And then the part that I don't really like about this is it requires users to perform multi-factor authentication when necessary. Now, I get it. Microsoft doesn't really want to necessarily divulge the secret sauce in there. And I don't think it's, intended that they don't want to share it with us. But I think the biggest premise for that is that they don't want to clearly define when or when it doesn't, because a bad actor could take advantage of those scenarios, right? But for me, I like to know exactly when it's supposed to happen and be able to figure out if something's working or not working right and be able to troubleshoot. Security defaults also block legacy authentication protocols, and then it protects privileged activities like access to the Azure admin portal. But for me, I like, back in the first part of the slides, I like to just turn off user access to Azure admin portal, period. This gets into, ensuring that they're MFA prompted when accessing the portal. So here's the official link from Microsoft on those details. So now let's transition into conditional access policies. So these, all right, I'm back on the Azure portal link, are found in Intra ID within the Azure portal and at the security setting at the bottom. And then in that protect conditional access policy section. And if you're following along, I don't know, some of you may be seeing these for the first time. Yeah, this is a little surprise. To be honest, I wish I was ahead of it and saw this, but I don't know about you. Even being a consultant, I find it hard to keep up with the hundreds, if not thousands, of update emails that Microsoft sends. And I was fishing around in our tenant and surprise, found this. This is the first time I've seen Microsoft actually implement. These are conditional access policies that have an MFA focus. We saw these being deployed in all of our clients' tenants. Now, they put them in the tenant as report only. And then they made this little note. If you click on them and you're in report only, you'll see this bubble come up on the right that says Microsoft will enable these no less than 90 days after they were created. So you'll see that create date. And good news is I haven't seen any of them turned on in exactly 90 days. They seem to be waiting a little bit. But for us, for prescriptive, for our production tenant, had we not disabled these, they would have been in contention and would have caused issue with our intended conditional access policy. So I just wanted to show you that. The way to make sure that they don't or not turned on is you either turn them to a disabled or off state, or you can delete them. And for some of you, maybe this is the first time you've seen conditional access policies. I'm going to transition into the next part of this presentation and kind of give you a good overall approach that I like to take for all tenants. So what I like to do is I like to deny sign-ins from any locations that my company is not based in. So for this example, we're going to say that this company that we're using, this fictitious company that we're going to be building these conditional access policies for, only does business in the US and Canada. And I know some of you cyber oriented folks are thinking, well, bad actors only just use a VPN to get in. Well, there's going to be some manners or mechanisms in place to protect that, right? That's what MFA is there for. But this is, let's move the chess pieces. Let's change the game. Let's not even allow them to knock on your front door. Let's cut out a lot of noise, honestly, right? So the key here is deny all logins from any countries outside, in this example, the US or Canada, but provide a mechanism to allow logins when people are traveling. And then number two, right, like I was talking about, for those that can log in, let's make sure that we require MFA for all users, but be sure to prevent MFA from breaking our service accounts, right? So, okay, let everybody in except for the US and Canada or traveling, force them to do MFA, but let our service accounts log in from wherever. But no, prevent service accounts from being MFA prompted, but really tighten it down to where, as I was talking about that segue from the autopilot question earlier, only allow those service accounts to log in from known IPs or trusted locations. So here's a logical flow of what I just talked about, but what we will be doing is actually showing you how to build 3 different conditional access policies that cover those scenarios, right? Number 1, block unknown countries. 2, require MFA for all users. And 3, block service accounts from unknown locations, right? So let's start with number 1. So here you will actually go into the conditional access policy settings and click on policies, right? But for blocking unknown countries, right, in our example, we want to allow only the US and Canada logins. We need to create that traveling user security group first, right? I'm not going to get into details of creating a security group, but these would be those users that are your executives or those executives that are on vacation and they need that ability to log in from, Mexico, or maybe they're in Europe or UK. So this would basically be that mechanism that would allow them to continue to work outside the US and Canada. And then what you're going to do is you're going to also need to create the allowed countries name location. So we need to specify we're going to allow US and Canada. And so this is where you would do that. You would go into conditional access policies, and down at the manage section, you would click on number 1, name locations, and then 2, click on the country's location. And then this is where we would name it, allowed countries. And then we would determine the country by its IP address on number 4. And then down on number 5 is where you would pick US and Canada. So think of this as the prerequisites, right? So we've created the traveling user security group and we've created the allowed countries name location. So now let's get into part 2, which is actually creating the conditional access policy. So instead of being down in that manage section, you're going to be up here in policies and you're going to click on new policy and then you're going to go through these settings, right? So conditional access policies have a selection, on the left of these different criteria. So I've kind of spelled out each of the sections that you would need to configure. So the target users would be all users except for those people that are in the traveling user security group. And what are we doing? Lower right hand, we're blocking access, right, for all users, unless you can see in the upper right the conditions. They're coming from my allowed countries, which is US and Canada. So just again, to kind of repeat the logic, block access for all users except for my traveling users, or for those people that are logging in from where I know they need to be logging in US and Canada. And the target resources that I've specified here is any apps, all apps, right? So I'll take a little bit. I like to name the conditional access policies. I like to start it with a verb to describe what it is that the policy is doing. And in this case, it's blocking and then what. So 6 months from now, when you look, it makes sense, right? So number 2, the verb, we're going to require MFA for all users. So like I was hinting at, number 1, the prerequisite in this case is going to be that service accounts security group. So we want to MFA prompt everybody but those accounts that would be in that security group. And then you would create the required MFA for all users CA policy. So again, you click on policies, you click on new policy, and then these are the settings that you would configure there. So we're going to require all users access, but require MFA, right? The lower right-hand corner. And we're going to exclude those service accounts and their access to all cloud apps. And then there's no conditions, right? So grant force MFA for everybody except the service account security group, right? So number 3, right? We're getting into the layers. We've blocked all US and Canada. We've allowed traveling users. We've allowed service accounts. So now let's shore up those service accounts. So the prerequisite for this, similar to the US and Canada locations, we're going to create another name location called service account known IPs. Now, this is just like the plus countries, but instead you do the IP ranges location. And you can see here, I've just named it service account known IPs. And then I know these are internal PIPA addresses, but these are /32. So I'm only allowing in this case 10.0.1.1 and 192.168.120. But the way it'll look is it'll look like external IPs. So where do you find those details? Well, you can look at sign-in logs over a long period of time, 7 days, 30 days. And in this case, I kind of give an example of a scanner account. It's very common for people to use a scanner account in order to do the scan to email on those multifunction printers. So what you could do is you could go look at that scanner account and see where that account is coming from at your different locations, right? Now, just a word of caution. What we're not saying here is to, do a large /16 address scope and let any account running in Google or Amazon, again, what is this? This is not MFA prompting your service accounts, but the beauty is you're really getting surgical and saying only this account can only log in from these locations, right? So you may have a few of you that are attending today that may have 1 or 2 very, very special accounts that would fit into a large scenario like this. But this, from what I've seen, will address 95 if not 98% of your use cases. Okay. So now we need to create part 2, right? We've got the IP addresses that we've specified that are safe, right, or trusted, that service accounts can come from. So now we're going to create the CA policy. Again, new policy, and then here's the settings, right, that we want to target, right? This is going to be a block. We're going to block our service accounts from logging in from anywhere except for those known IPs or trusted locations, right? So we're specifically targeting only the service accounts in this manner. And the target resources is their access to any and all cloud apps. Okay. And then, as I promised before in the previous one, right? So we talked about that one switch where you could MFA protect device joins and registrations if you're on security defaults. Well, I didn't forget number 4 here, right? To show you how to configure a conditional access policy to derive that. Now, this one's a little tricky. I like to say, again, it's hidden in plain sight. It's actually, you have to go right on the left, target resources. You have to click there and you have to change it from cloud apps to user actions. So when you do that, that's where it will show the register or join devices. So in this case, you would create that CA policy, MFA required for device registrations. You would target your users, right? And specifically that user action of register and joining, and then you would grant with your MFA access. So yeah, this one always gets me, you know, after I've slept overnight. It's like, where was that setting again? So let's talk about an approach, right? So you have security defaults. How do you get over to conditional access policies? Well, I like to use the notion of crawl, walk, or run, but you'll see out there that Microsoft is very clear about you can have security defaults or conditional access policies, but you can't have both. Well, you can, because you can put your conditional access policies in read port only mode, which was kind of like those Microsoft created conditional access policies. That's how they created those. Well, report only allows you to turn them on without turning them on, without enforcing them, but you can use reporting and you can look at, I don't know about you, but there's a confusing way, it's a different tab, but I wanted to be sure and show you this what if tool. This is another nice feature, just kind of like the Office inventory tools. You know, you get into your conditional access policies and then you have this what if mechanism at the top. It gets crazy, right? You can specify a specific account. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to walk through, hey, I have a conditional access policy scenario that I need to understand. Well, you would pick that service account, you pick the apps that they're trying to access, maybe, maybe not. And then you can actually get into the IP address in the country that the drill is where they would be logging in from. And then you would click on this and it will tell you exactly, oh, here's the CA policies that would be applied, and up to and including, yeah, legacy authentication is blocked. It's a very, very useful tool, because even I have a hard time trying to put all these CAs in the way that they're built in these screens, right, with all these settings. Logically, it doesn't really flow right in my head. This makes it almost like a single pane view and gets you there real quick. And what used to maybe take me 30 minutes and maybe even drawing it out on a piece of paper to try to understand and remember, right? How did I configure these? This does it, maybe 30 minutes over here. This will do it in a couple minutes very quickly. So that's it. That's what we wanted to cover today. And I want to thank you all for attending. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually drop a form here, right? So if you want to talk to me or my Microsoft team, right, you have interest, you like what you've seen here. I think, a lot of webinars out there, hype, content. And then when you actually get to the delivery, there's really not a lot of meat on the bones, I guess you would say. Hopefully, regardless of your situation, whether you're new to this game or you've been around for a while, and I hope each one of you had something that was you can take home and take back to your organization and actually start thinking about and making improvements. So again, for those that maybe have joined late, a copy of this presentation will be provided with those links, hot links, so you'll be able to access all of these reference materials that I provided. And so with that. Oh, so please fill out the form if you would like to talk to us, talk to my team further, and we will definitely get with you on that. And so we'll start the Q&A session for the back half, or maybe you've had time to think about other questions on the front half. So if you would like, we can use either the chat or the QA. So does anybody have any questions about the security defaults, conditional access policies, kind of our recommendation, our layered approach, or anything from the user device settings that we covered previously, up to including inventory? Just trying to run through it back in my head, or the enterprise app registrations.
Hey, Mark, I got another one for you in my inbox here. Can you talk through the Office 365 inventory tool again? I guess like a high level, just recap.
Okay. Yeah, I'll zoom back through. Sorry, everybody close your eyes. Move real fast. So there is, believe it or not, an actual full-blown device inventory tool that's available. And the key mechanism here, as long as you install the Office 365 click to run apps, so Word, PowerPoint, what you would normally do, it functions as an endpoint agent to actually gather CPU details, RAM details. But I think the most important part, right? You have to pay for these. If you want an inventory tool that does this, you actually have to pay for it. But it's free with Office, included with Office, that is. It maps the user's computer to their name. So you get that person to device linkage. So it's not just hey, how many Dell computers do I have out there? How many IBMs? No. How many devices is Tom using, right? How many devices is Mark using? Oh, wow. Okay. We did assign him that other one and he hasn't given that back. So you can start to gather some really interesting stuff from this tool here. Great question. Any other questions? Just kind of leave it open a bit. I got questions flowing in. Would it be important to monitor for new devices? Yeah, so I talked about these inventory tools. I think you bring up a good question there, or a good aspect there, Terry. New devices, right? Anytime you're looking at inventory management, I like to think in age, right? So within these tools, I did show you can get your device reports out of Intra, and then that also that cool new Office inventory tool you may not have been aware of. But the key is, when was that object created? In other words, when was it born or registered or joined in your domain? And then number two, when was the last time it spoke? Those are important. So kind of going in the opposite direction of Terry's question, right? I would be concerned about any old devices, right? Things that have been out there for a long time and haven't talked, right? You want to prune those. But as for new devices, absolutely, right? If you are following the recommendations that we provided here, right? You're MFA enforcing users whenever they join or register devices. You probably have it locked down, right? To only your IT group can join assets. And you've also done an initial pruning of your inventory. So yeah, I would be interested and I would want to monitor new devices that join my tenant. Another recommendation, I didn't get in here, but if you have a standard naming convention of your systems and all of a sudden you see an on-ball machine come in that doesn't match that naming standard, well, that's an indicator of something. Is that a bad machine that got in, or an unknown machine, or is somehow somebody not following process and able to join devices? So I'm more about looking at the signals, right? And as I go through this journey of tightening things and understanding where we are in that process, these could be key indicators of the process working, or potential loopholes, right? And can Intune manage and wipe Apple and Android devices? So that's kind of the tricky question, right? I think the key here is it a corporate owned device or is it a BYOD personally managed device? Well, if it's a corporate owned device, you can nuke that device. You can blow it away. You can block it, right? Because you got full control over the full aspects and config of the actual device itself. Whereas a BYOD device, it's more about MAM, and so you own the container, right, of data that's tied to those applications. Okay. Now, one slight curveball in this is if you haven't configured conditional access policies that mandate standard applications, I guess the best example would be on an iOS device. If you're allowing users to configure native email and then, right, and not forcing them to use the Outlook app, well, that's two different scenarios where an Outlook app would be true mobile application management, where it's almost containerized within the the Outlook mobile app on the iOS device. And so you can basically reclaim or delete or remove that information from that mobile device. Whereas if it's the former, where it's doing a native email config, there are mechanisms that you would have to leverage in your active sync areas, right, in Exchange admin in order to drive purging of that. So that's why everybody encourages moving towards the Outlook app for iOS devices, because of that built-in capability. That answers your question. Okay, well, I think I was going to pause for a little bit more, but I think that's good enough for Q&A session. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Hopefully, like I was saying earlier, you got some sort of nugget, one thing, two things, maybe even more to take back to the organization. So thank you, and I appreciate you joining us today.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. And like Mark said, a copy will go out. Jillian will follow up and send an email. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Have a good day, everyone.